On a crisp autumn morning in the heart of a bustling city, the firehouse was alive with its usual rhythm: coffee brewing, boots thudding against the polished floors, and radios crackling with static updates. This was a team bonded by the shared burden of running into danger when everyone else was running away. But today, there was an undercurrent of tension, a ripple of unease among the seasoned firefighters as they sized up their newest recruit. Darius Carter stood near the entrance, adjusting the strap of his gear bag. His tall frame exuded confidence, but his eyes carried the weight of a man used to proving himself repeatedly. Darius was no stranger to challenges. Growing up in a tight-knit neighborhood, he'd watch his parents juggle multiple jobs while instilling in him an unshakable belief in hard work and perseverance. Joining the fire department wasn't just a career choice, it was a calling. But as Darius stepped into the firehouse that morning, he felt the sharp edge of skepticism cutting through the air. The sideways glances, the hushed murmurs, he could sense them. Some of the older firefighters, men who had seen decades of flames and smoke, weren't shy about questioning if the rookie could handle the pressure. It wasn't just his lack of experience they doubted, it was the color of his skin. Though unspoken, the bias was palpable. Captain Harris, a grizzled veteran with a no-nonsense demeanor, called for a briefing. His voice boomed over the hum of conversation as he outlined the day's drills. "Carter, you'll be shadowing Martinez and O'Connell. Watch, learn, and keep up," he barked. There was no warmth in his tone, just a clipped efficiency that left no room for debate. As the team moved to their assigned tasks, Darius felt a hand clap his shoulder. He turned to see Martinez, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a perpetual smirk. "Don't let it get to you, kid," Martinez said in a low voice. "They were the same way with me when I started. You'll prove yourself soon enough." Darius nodded, grateful for the small gesture of solidarity, even if Martinez's words were laced with resignation. Hours later, the piercing sound of the alarm shattered the relative calm. "Warehouse fire, 2 blocks over. Move out," Captain Harris shouted. The team sprang into action, sliding into their gear with practiced precision. As the fire truck rolled to life, its sirens wailing, Darius felt a surge of adrenaline. This was his moment, a chance to show that he wasn't just another rookie, that he belonged here as much as anyone else. The scene that greeted them was chaotic. Flames licked at the sides of the massive warehouse, thick black smoke billowing into the sky. The acrid scent of burning chemicals stung their nostrils as they approached. Onlookers crowded the perimeter, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. Captain Harris quickly barked orders, sending teams to different sections of the building. "Carter, you're with me," Harris commanded, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. As they moved toward the east entrance, Darius caught snippets of muttered comments from his colleagues. "Let's see if the rookie can handle this," someone said. The words stung, but Darius pushed them aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. Inside, the heat was oppressive, the air thick with smoke. Visibility was almost non-existent, and the crackling of flames was deafening. They moved cautiously but swiftly, scanning for any signs of trapped workers. Suddenly, a faint cry for help pierced through the chaos. Darius's heart leaped. He turned to Harris, who nodded sharply. "Go," the captain ordered. Darius moved toward the sound, his instincts guiding him through the labyrinth of flames and debris. He found a young woman huddled beneath a collapsed beam, her face streaked with soot and terror. "I've got you," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. With strength born of determination, he lifted the beam just enough to free her, pulling her into his arms. As he carried her toward the exit, the structure groaned ominously. A section of the ceiling collapsed behind them, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Darius didn't stop. His focus was singular: get her out, no matter what. When they finally burst through the doors into the open air, a cheer erupted from the crowd. Paramedics rushed to take the woman from his arms, and for a moment, Darius stood there, catching his breath, his mind racing. But the ordeal wasn't over yet. Inside that warehouse, the flames were still raging, and more lives were likely at stake. Captain Harris approached, his expression unreadable. "Good job, Carter," he said gruffly, before turning back to coordinate the next phase of the rescue. Darius barely had time to process the words before the captain's next order rang out. "We're going back in." And just like that, Darius found himself standing at the edge of the inferno once more, ready to prove, again and again, that doubt had no place in a firehouse. The heat of the flames was relentless, and every step back into the warehouse felt like walking into an oven. Darius adjusted his mask, the air inside the building thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning chemicals. His mind raced, replaying the moments before he carried the young woman to safety. There were more people inside, there had to be. The faint sounds of shouting and the groaning structure told him time was running out. Captain Harris was already issuing orders, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Martinez, O'Connell, sweep the west side. Carter, you're with me again. Let's move." The team splintered into their groups, their movements precise and practiced despite the pandemonium. Darius kept close to Harris as they pushed deeper into the warehouse. Flames clawed at the walls, sending shards of burning debris crashing to the floor. The roar of the fire was deafening, but Darius could hear his own breathing loud and clear, each inhale a reminder of the limited oxygen in his tank. He had trained for this. Hours and hours of drills, simulations, and lectures. But no amount of training could fully prepare anyone for the sheer unpredictability of a real fire. As they turned a corner, a loud explosion rocked the building, throwing both men off balance. Darius hit the ground hard, the force of the blast sending a cloud of ash and embers into the air. Harris was already back on his feet, shouting, "You good, Carter?" Darius nodded, though his ears were ringing and his heart was hammering in his chest. The explosion had opened up a section of the floor, revealing a lower level that neither of them had seen on the building's layout. Through the gap, Darius could make out flickering flames and hear faint cries for help. Harris hesitated for a split second, then made the call. "We're going down there. Follow my lead." The two men navigated their way to a stairwell, their progress slowed by falling debris and the intense heat. As they descended, Darius couldn't help but notice how Harris moved with a mixture of confidence and urgency. The captain had seen his share of fires, more than Darius could even imagine, and his experience was evident in every step he took. When they reached the lower level, the scene was worse than they had anticipated. Flames were consuming wooden pallets and cardboard boxes stacked to the ceiling. The smoke was thicker here, and the air was almost unbreathable despite their masks. Darius scanned the room, his flashlight cutting through the haze. That's when he saw them, a group of workers huddled in a corner, their faces pale and streaked with soot. "Over here," Darius shouted, waving Harris toward the group. The workers were terrified, their eyes wide with panic. Harris quickly assessed the situation. "We'll get you out," he said firmly. "Stay low, cover your mouths, and follow us." Darius took the lead, guiding the workers back toward the stairwell while Harris stayed at the rear, ensuring no one was left behind. The heat was unbearable, and every step felt like a battle against an invisible force. One of the workers, an older man, stumbled, coughing violently. Without hesitation, Darius scooped him up, his muscles straining under the weight. The group made it back to the main floor, but the fire had grown more aggressive. Flames now engulfed large sections of the building, and the ceiling creaked ominously, threatening to collapse at any moment. Harris barked into his radio, calling for backup and an update on the structural integrity of the warehouse. As they neared the exit, Darius's mind flashed back to the earlier comments from his colleagues, the doubts, the snide remarks, the unspoken judgment. He wasn't just fighting the fire, he was fighting to prove himself, to earn a place in a team that didn't yet see him as one of their own. The group finally burst through the exit, coughing and gasping for fresh air. Paramedics swarmed them, tending to the workers and checking for injuries. Darius set the older man down gently, his arms trembling from the effort. He looked around, his eyes scanning the scene for Harris. The captain emerged moments later, his gear covered in soot and his expression grim. He approached Darius, giving him a quick nod of acknowledgement. "Good work, Carter," he said simply before turning to coordinate the next phase of the operation. But there was no time to dwell on the small victory. A new problem had arisen. One of the firefighters was missing. O'Connell hadn't reported back, and his last known location was deep inside the building, near the west side. The tension among the team was palpable as Harris quickly organized a search effort. Darius didn't hesitate. "Uncle," he said, stepping forward. Harris looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You sure about this, Carter?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Darius replied, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. He knew what was at stake, not just O'Connell's life, but his own. Harris gave a curt nod. "Martinez, go with him. And Carter, be careful." The two men re-entered the inferno, their movements swift but cautious. The west side of the building was a maze of twisted metal and burning debris. The heat was even more intense here, and Darius could feel the sweat dripping down his back despite the protective gear. As they moved deeper into the building, Darius couldn't shake the feeling that every step was a gamble. The structure was unstable, and the fire showed no signs of slowing down. But he pushed forward, his flashlight sweeping the area as he called out for O'Connell. Finally, they found him. O'Connell was pinned under a collapsed beam, his face pale but conscious. "Took you long enough," he muttered weakly, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "Hang tight," Darius said, kneeling beside him. He and Martinez worked quickly, using their tools to lift the beam just enough to free O'Connell. It was grueling work, the heat sapping their strength with every passing second. As they lifted O'Connell to his feet, the building groaned loudly, a clear warning that time was running out. "We need to move, now," Martinez shouted. Darius supported O'Connell as they made their way back toward the exit. The path was treacherous, with flames closing in and debris falling all around them. But Darius refused to let fear take hold. He focused on each step, each breath, determined to see this through. When they finally emerged from the building, the relief was almost overwhelming. The crowd outside erupted into cheers as the team carried O'Connell to safety. Paramedics rushed to tend to him, their movements efficient and practiced. Darius stood off to the side, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, their expressions a mix of surprise and respect. For the first time since joining the firehouse, he felt like he was more than just the new guy, more than the rookie they doubted. But as the flames continued to consume the warehouse, Darius knew this was just the beginning. There would be other fires, other challenges, and other moments where he would have to prove himself all over again, and he was ready. The night after the warehouse fire, the firehouse was unusually quiet. The usual banter and easy laughter that echoed through the halls were absent. The team had done their job, saved lives, and returned home safe, but the weight of the day still lingered. Darius sat at the edge of his bunk, staring at his hands. They still trembled slightly, the adrenaline refusing to fully leave his system. He replayed every moment of the rescue, from the explosion to carrying O'Connell out of the flames. He couldn't help but wonder if he had truly earned their respect, or if they were simply relieved to have made it out alive. The doubt gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. Actions spoke louder than words, and he knew his work wasn't done. In the common room, a few of the guys sat around the table, their conversation low and cautious. Martinez glanced over at Darius and motioned for him to join them. Reluctantly, Darius got up and walked over. "You were solid out there," Martinez said, his voice sincere. "O'Connell owes you big time." "Yeah," chimed in another firefighter, Jackson. "You handled yourself like a pro. Not every rookie can say they've pulled off a save like that." Darius nodded, a small flicker of pride warming his chest, but the words still felt hollow. It wasn't just about proving himself in one fire, It was about proving that he deserved to be here every single day. Across the room, Captain Harris was deep in conversation with the deputy chief. Their voices were low, but their expressions were serious. Darius caught snippets of the discussion, something about the warehouse's poor safety standards and how the fire could have been much worse. The deputy chief glanced over at Darius, his expression unreadable, before nodding and walking away. Later that night, Darius found himself in the garage, checking over his gear. It was a habit he picked up during training, a way to calm his mind and prepare for whatever came next. As he worked, Harris entered, his heavy boots echoing in the empty space. "Carter," the captain said, his tone neutral. Darius straightened up, unsure of what was coming. "Yes, sir." Harris crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "You did good today, better than I expected." The words caught Darius off guard. He wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a backhanded acknowledgement of the doubts Harris had held. "Thank you, sir," Darius replied, keeping his tone respectful. Harris nodded but didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against one of the trucks, his expression softening slightly. "You're not the first rookie to have a rough start here," he said. "This team's been through a lot. We've lost people, seen things most folks can't even imagine. It makes us wary. But you showed heart today. That matters." Darius listened, his chest tightening. He wanted to ask why it had to be this way, why proving himself felt like an uphill battle made steeper by unspoken biases, but he held back. This wasn't the time or place for that conversation. "Just keep showing up," Harris continued. "That's how you earn their trust. One fire, one call, one save at a time." The captain pushed off the truck and left, leaving Darius alone with his thoughts. His words hung in the air, a mix of encouragement and challenge. The next few days brought a strange mix of normalcy and tension. The firehouse returned to its usual rhythm, but Darius noticed subtle changes. The glances from his colleagues were less skeptical, and the snide comments had all but disappeared. Even O'Connell, who had been one of the more vocal doubters, gave him a nod of thanks as they passed each other in the hallway. But not everyone was on board. There were still whispers, quiet conversations that stopped when Darius entered the room. He didn't need to hear the words to know what they were about. Change came slowly, and not everyone was ready for it. One afternoon, during a routine equipment check, Martinez pulled Darius aside. "There's something you should know," he said, his voice low. "What is it?" Darius asked, frowning. "There's been talk," Martinez said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "About the warehouse fire. Some guys are saying you got lucky, that it was a fluke." Darius felt his stomach tighten. "A fluke?" he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. Martinez shrugged. "You know how it is. Some people don't like admitting they were wrong. They're looking for any excuse to hold onto their doubts." Darius clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling to the surface. He had risked his life, saved people, and still it wasn't enough for some of them. "Don't let it get to you," Martinez said, his tone firm. "You're here because you earned it. The ones who matter see that." Darius nodded, grateful for the support, but still unable to shake the anger simmering beneath the surface. That night, the firehouse was jolted awake by another alarm. This time, it was a residential fire in a densely packed neighborhood. The team moved quickly, adrenaline surging as they donned their gear and boarded the trucks. When they arrived, the scene was chaotic. Flames consumed the upper floors of a 3-story apartment building, and panicked residents were spilling onto the street. Darius could hear screams coming from inside, and his heart sank. As the team split up to tackle the blaze, Darius found himself paired with O'Connell. The older firefighter was still recovering from his injuries, but insisted on being part of the action. "Let's go," O'Connell said, his tone brusque. They entered the building, the heat and smoke instantly overwhelming. Darius stayed close to O'Connell, his senses on high alert, then moved quickly, checking rooms and guiding residents to safety. In one of the apartments, they found a young boy hiding under a bed, his face streaked with tears and soot. Darius crouched down, his voice gentle. "It's okay, buddy. I'm here to help. Let's get you out of here." The boy hesitated, his small frame trembling with fear. Darius reached out, his movements slow and reassuring. Finally, the boy crawled out, and Darius swooped him up, shielding him from the smoke as they made their way back to the stairs. But as they descended, a loud crash echoed from above. Part of the ceiling had collapsed, cutting off their exit. O'Connell cursed under his breath, his eyes scanning for another way out. "We'll figure it out," Darius said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. The tension in the air was suffocating, the flames closing in as they searched for a new path. Darius held the boy tightly, his mind racing with possibilities. He refused to give up, not now, not ever. And as the fire rolled around them, he realized this was more than just a test of his skills. It was a test of his resolve, his ability to rise above the doubts and prove not just to his team, but to himself that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The heat was unbearable, and the smoke thickened with every passing second. Darius held the boy close, his arms straining but steady. O'Connell's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent. "This way, there's another stairwell." He pointed toward the far side of the hallway, where the flames hadn't yet reached. Darius followed, his heart pounding. The roar of the fire was deafening, and every step felt like walking into the unknown. The boy clung to him, his tiny hands gripping Darius's jacket with a desperation that fueled his determination. They reached the stairwell, but the sight that greeted them stopped them in their tracks. The stairs were partially collapsed, the lower section buried under rubble. O'Connell swore under his breath, his eyes darting around for another option. Darius scanned the area, his mind racing. The fire was closing in, and the building groaned ominously, threatening to give way at any moment. "We don't have time," O'Connell said, his voice tense. "We've got to move." Darius nodded, his grip on the boy tightening. "We'll make it," he said, more to himself than anyone else. He glanced up and spotted a narrow ledge along the wall that led to another door. It was risky, but it was their only chance. "Over there," Darius said, pointing to the ledge. "We can use that to get across." O'Connell hesitated, his face a mixture of doubt and urgency. But there was no other choice. He nodded. "You go first. I'll cover you." Darius stepped onto the ledge, his movements slow and deliberate. The boy whimpered, burying his face in Darius's shoulder. "It's okay," Darius whispered. "We're going to get out of here." The ledge was narrow, barely wide enough for his boots, and the heat from the flames below made every step feel precarious. Darius focused on his breathing, on keeping his balance, on ignoring the sweat dripping into his eyes. When he reached the other side, he gently set the boy down and turned back to help O'Connell. The older firefighter was halfway across when a loud crack echoed through the building. The wall behind him buckled, sending a shower of debris cascading down. "Move!" Darius shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. O'Connell lunged forward just as the ledge crumbled beneath him. Darius reached out, grabbing his arm and pulling him to safety. They both collapsed onto the floor, breathing heavily. "Thanks," O'Connell said, his voice hoarse. Darius nodded, too focused on their next move to respond. He picked up the boy again, cradling him protectively. They pushed through the door and found themselves in another hallway, this one less consumed by flames. The air was still thick with smoke, but the way forward was clear. As they moved, Darius's radio crackled to life. It was Captain Harris. "Carter, O'Connell, report. Do you copy?" Darius fumbled with the radio, his hands shaking. "This is Carter. We've got one civilian with us. We're heading toward the east exit." "Understood," Harris replied. "We've got teams waiting for you. Get out of there now." The urgency in Harris' voice was unmistakable. Darius quickened his pace, O'Connell close behind. They were almost there, the faint glow of the exit sign just ahead. But as they rounded the corner, the ceiling above them gave way. A massive beam crashed down, blocking their path and sending sparks flying. The boy screamed, and Darius shielded him with his body, the heat searing against his back. O'Connell coughed, his voice strained. "We're trapped." Darius's mind raced. The flames were closing in, and the building was seconds away from collapse. He glanced around, searching for another way out. That's when he saw it, a small window near the ceiling. It was their only chance. "Help me boost him up," Darius said, motioning to the boy. O'Connell hesitated, his face pale. "You're not going to fit through there." "I'll worry about that later," Darius said firmly. "Just help me get him out." Together, they lifted the boy, guiding him through the window and into the waiting arms of the firefighters outside. The boy's cries faded as he was carried to safety, leaving Darius and O'Connell alone once more. The heat was unbearable now, the flames licking at their heels. Darius turned to O'Connell, his jaw set. "We're not dying here. Let's go." They pushed forward, navigating through the debris and flames with a determination born of sheer willpower. Every step was a battle, every breath a struggle. The building groaned around them, the walls trembling as if ready to collapse. Finally, they reached another door, this one leading to a storage room. It was their last hope. Darius kicked it open, and they stumbled inside, coughing and gasping for air. But the fire wasn't done with them yet. A loud explosion shook the building, and the room filled with smoke and flames. Darius's vision blurred, his strength waning. He could hear O'Connell's voice, faint and distant, but the words were lost in the chaos. And then, just as the darkness threatened to take over, Darius saw it, a faint glimmer of light cutting through the smoke. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was enough to reignite his resolve. "We're almost there," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We're almost there." The faint glimmer of light gave Darius just enough hope to push forward. He staggered toward it, pulling O'Connell with him. The room was filled with smoke so thick it was like wading through a fog of despair. Every breath burned, and every movement felt like dragging himself through quicksand. But Darius wasn't ready to give up, not when they were this close. "Stay with me," he rasped to O'Connell, who was leaning heavily against him. O'Connell nodded weakly, his face pale beneath the streaks of soot. The light was coming from a vent near the floor. It was small, barely large enough to crawl through, but it was a way out. Darius dropped to his knees, his lungs screaming for clean air, and began yanking at the metal grate. It was bolted tightly, but desperation gave him strength. With a final pull, it came loose, and he shoved it aside. "We've got to crawl," he said, glancing at O'Connell. "You go first." O'Connell shook his head. "You're faster. Get out and pull me through if I don't make it." There wasn't time to argue. Darius slid into the vent, the cool air inside a stark contrast to the blistering heat of the room. The metal scraped against his arms and legs as he crawled, but he didn't stop. Behind him, O'Connell followed, his labored breaths echoing in the confined space. The vent twisted and turned, leading them closer to the outside. Darius could feel the fresh air ahead, cool and inviting. Relief surged through him as he reached the end and pushed open the exit, tumbling out onto the pavement. Firefighters rushed to his side, pulling him up and checking for injuries, but Darius shook them off. "O'Connell," he gasped. "He's still in there." He turned back to the vent just as O'Connell's hand appeared. Darius grabbed it, pulling with all his strength until the older firefighter was free. They both collapsed onto the ground, coughing and gasping for air. But before Darius could fully process their escape, a shout pierced the air. "We've got another issue." Captain Harris was pointing toward the side of the building, where flames were now licking at a propane tank. The fire was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, and the tank was dangerously close to exploding. Darius's heart sank. The building was already on the verge of collapse, and an explosion would send debris flying into the surrounding neighborhood. They had to act fast. Harris's voice cut through the chaos. "We need a team to secure that tank. Volunteers." Darius didn't hesitate. "I'll go," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion weighing him down. O'Connell grabbed his arm. "You've done enough. Let someone else handle it." Darius shook his head. "I can do this. I have to." Harris nodded, his expression grim. "All right, Carter. Be quick and stay sharp." Darius grabbed a fire extinguisher and made his way toward the tank, the heat intensifying with every step. The ground was littered with debris, and the air was thick with smoke, but he pressed on. He could hear the hissing of the propane escaping, a sinister sound that promised destruction if he didn't act fast. As he approached, a sudden movement caught his eye. A shadow darted behind the tank, barely visible through the smoke. Darius froze, his instincts kicking in. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice hoarse. A figure emerged, a man, his face streaked with soot and panic. He was holding a wrench, frantically trying to close the valve on the tank. "What are you doing?" Darius shouted, moving closer. The man looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "I work here. I thought I could stop it, but it's stuck." Darius cursed under his breath. The situation had just gotten more complicated. The valve was jammed, and the man was too panicked to think clearly. Darius had to act fast. "Step back," Darius ordered, taking the wrench from the man. "I'll handle it." The man hesitated, then nodded and moved away, his hands trembling. Darius knelt beside the tank, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. He gripped the wrench tightly and began turning the valve, the metal groaning in protest. The hissing grew louder, and for a terrifying moment, Darius thought it was too late. But then, with a final twist, the valve snapped shut. The hissing stopped, and the immediate danger was averted. Darius exhaled, relief washing over him. But the moment was short-lived. A loud crack echoed from the building behind him, and he turned just in time to see the roof collapse in a shower of sparks and debris. The explosion he feared didn't happen, but the destruction was still catastrophic. Firefighters scrambled to contain the blaze, their shouts filling the air. Darius stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. The man he'd saved grabbed his arm, pulling him back to reality. "You saved us," the man said, his voice shaking. Darius didn't respond. He couldn't. The weight of everything, the fire, the lives at stake, the doubts that had followed him since his first day, pressed down on him like a physical force. But there was no time to dwell on it. There was still work to do. As he rejoined the team, Harris clapped him on the shoulder. "Good work, Carter. You might have just saved this whole block." Darius nodded, his expression grim. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't just surviving the fire, he was conquering it. The fire raged on, but the propane tank was no longer a threat. Darius stood amidst the chaos, his body aching from exhaustion and burns he barely registered. Around him, firefighters continued their battle against the relentless flames, the air thick with shouts and the roar of the inferno. The building groaned again, the sound a grim reminder that it was moments away from total collapse. Captain Harris's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "Everyone fall back. The structure's coming down." Darius turned toward the retreating firefighters, his legs screaming at him to follow. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something, or someone, moving inside the collapsing structure. He froze, squinting through the smoke. "No," he whispered to himself. It was a figure, a small, frail form stumbling in the haze. A child. His heart dropped. Somehow, someone had been left behind. The boy they'd rescued earlier hadn't been the only one. He turned back toward the fire, adrenaline surging through him like a second wind. "Carter, fall back," Harris shouted, his voice laced with urgency. "There's someone in there." Darius yelled back. Without waiting for approval, he sprinted toward the building, ignoring the shouts behind him. The heat was unbearable as he pushed his way inside, the smoke immediately stinging his eyes and filling his lungs. He dropped low, crawling through the debris, following the faint sound of sobs. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but he pressed on. "Hey," he called out, his voice hoarse. "I'm here to help. Where are you?" The sobbing grew louder, and then he saw her, a little girl, no older than 5, crouched behind a fallen beam. Her tiny face was streaked with tears and soot, her hands clutching a stuffed animal to her chest. "It's okay," Darius said, crawling closer. "I'm here to get you out." The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't move, frozen in place. Darius reached out, his voice gentle. "I've got you. Let's get out of here." Slowly, she reached for him, and he scooped her into his arms. The beam above them creaked ominously, and Darius knew they had seconds to escape. Clutching the girl tightly, he retraced his steps, moving as quickly as he could through the collapsing structure. Flames licked at the walls, and the heat was suffocating, but he kept going, focusing on the small figure in his arms. Finally, he saw it, the faint outline of the exit through the smoke. He pushed forward, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. Just as he reached the door, the ceiling behind him gave way with a deafening crash. He dove through the exit, shielding the girl as debris rained down around them. They hit the pavement hard, and for a moment, Darius couldn't move. He felt hands pulling him up, voices shouting, but all he could focus on was the girl in his arms. "Is she okay?" he croaked, his voice barely audible. A paramedic knelt beside him, gently taking the girl from his arms. "She's breathing," the paramedic said. "You did good, Firefighter." Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. As he sat up, coughing and gasping for air, he noticed Captain Harris standing nearby, his expression grim. "You're lucky to be alive, Carter," Harris said, his voice heavy. "That was reckless." Darius nodded, too exhausted to argue. He knew Harris was right, but then the captain's expression softened, and it was brave. "You saved her life." The team gathered around him, their faces a mix of awe and respect. Even O'Connell, who had been one of his harshest critics, stepped forward and extended a hand. "You've got guts, Carter," he said. "I'll give you that." Darius shook his hand, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. He had proven himself, not just to his team but to himself. But just as the relief began to settle, one of the investigators approached, holding a charred piece of metal. "We've got a problem," he said, his tone serious. This wasn't an accident. The fire was started intentionally. Darius froze, the words cutting through his exhaustion like a knife. He looked at the investigator, his mind racing. "What do you mean?" The investigator held up the metal piece. "We found an accelerant near the propane tank. Someone wanted this place to burn." The revelation hit like a punch to the gut. The fire hadn't just been a random disaster, it was deliberate. And suddenly, everything Darius thought he'd survived felt like only the beginning. The weight of the investigator's words lingered in the air, silencing the chaos around them. Darius stared at the charred piece of evidence, his mind reeling. Deliberate. Someone had wanted this destruction. Someone had risked lives, children's lives, for reasons he couldn't yet comprehend. As firefighters worked to extinguish the last stubborn flames and paramedics tended to the injured, Darius stood rooted to the spot. His body was aching, his lungs still burning from the smoke, but his mind refused to rest. Who could do something like this? And why? Captain Harris approached, his face a mixture of concern and resolve. "Carter, you need to get checked out," he said, gesturing toward the paramedics. Darius shook his head. "I'm fine. I need to know why this happened." Harris placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out. That's for the investigators now. You've done more than enough today." For a moment, Darius wanted to argue, to push back against the idea of stepping away. But he could see the exhaustion in Harris' eyes, the same exhaustion he felt in every fiber of his being. He nodded reluctantly and let the paramedics check him over, though his mind was still racing. As the hours passed and the fire was finally brought under control, the site transformed into a scene of investigation. Police officers and fire marshals combed through the wreckage, searching for clues about who could have started the blaze. Darius watched from the sidelines, a blanket draped over his shoulders as he sipped water to soothe his raw throat. O'Connell sat down beside him, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "You were incredible in there," he said after a long pause. "I've been doing this job for years, and I don't think I've ever seen someone handle themselves like that." Darius glanced at him, surprised. "Thanks," he said quietly. O'Connell hesitated, then added, "I misjudged you. I think we all did. You've got what it takes, Carter, and then some." The words meant more to Darius than he could express. For weeks he carried the weight of their doubt, pushing himself to prove that he belonged. Hearing O'Connell admit he'd been wrong felt like finally letting go of that burden. But even as he accepted the compliment, his thoughts drifted back to the fire. The image of the little girl's terrified face and the hissing propane tank haunted him. This wasn't over, not really. Darius couldn't stop thinking about the man he'd seen by the propane tank, the one who'd claimed to work there. Something about his panicked behavior didn't sit right. Why had he been there? Why hadn't he called for help? When he mentioned it to Harris, the captain frowned. "That's a good point. I'll pass it along to the investigators. They'll want to talk to him." Days turned into weeks, and life at the station began to settle back into a routine. The team treated Darius differently now, with a respect that hadn't been there before. O'Connell even invited him to join their regular card games, a gesture that felt like a rite of passage. But the fire still lingered in Darius's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that there was more to the story. Then, one evening, as he was heading home after a long shift, his phone buzzed. It was Harris. "Carter, you're going to want to hear this," he said, his voice tense. Darius felt his pulse quicken. "What's going on?" They caught him. The guy who started the fire. Turns out it was the warehouse manager. He was trying to cover up some financial trouble. Embezzlement, we think. He set the fire hoping to destroy the records and collect the insurance money. Darius's stomach churned. The thought of someone intentionally risking lives for money made his blood boil. "What about the little girl?" he asked. "How did she get left behind?" Harris sighed. "She wasn't supposed to be there. Her mom works in the office, and she brought her in that day because she couldn't find a sitter. The manager didn't know she was there." The explanation didn't make it any easier to stomach. Darius thanked Harris and hung up, his thoughts swirling. He felt a mix of relief and anger. Relief that the culprit had been caught, but anger at the sheer recklessness of it all. That night, as he sat in his small apartment, staring out the window at the city lights, Darius reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about the doubts he faced, the lives he'd saved, and the team that had finally come to accept him. He thought about the risks of the job and the courage it took to face them every day. He also thought about the little girl, safe now because he hadn't hesitated. Her life, and the lives of so many others, were worth every scar, every ache, every sleepless night. When he returned to the station the next morning, he felt different. Stronger, more sure of himself. The doubts were gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing he'd done his job, and done it well. The team greeted him with nods and smiles, a silent acknowledgement of everything they'd been through together. And as Darius suited up for the next call, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. This wasn't just a job, it was a calling, and he was ready for whatever came next.